according to media reports, the US has planned its first test of an intercontinental ballistic missile capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, following Donald Trump's order to resume nuclear weapons testing. Mark, do you think we are returning to a Cold War era dynamics where the arms race set the global agenda? And I'm also curious why Moscow and Washington raising the nuclear stakes now.
Yeah, no, it's amazing how this story is taking off. I just was contacted by Egyptian national TV before we came on, wanting to talk about this very subject because it's gotten everyone's attention. I think, however, though, that people need to look at this at a little bit higher altitude. Basically, Putin attempted to do a power play on Trump by the announcement of this this loitering capability missile that they have that can stay in space and is invincible, as he put it. And Trump wasn't having anything of it. And so he responded by saying, okay, the U.S. hasn't tested weapons since September of 1982. But we're going to get back in that business. So I think a lot of this is just messaging. It's pushing back. And I think part of it also, what I would also suggest people take a look at, there's more to this than just the nuclear aspect of it. There's also the fact that Sergei Lavrov, appears to have been at least temporarily sidelined a bit here, because he's the one that is alleged to have overplayed this hand of saying, look, get tough with Trump instead of buttering him up, threaten nuclear weapons. And it failed. And so suddenly you had Kirill Dmitriev flying to the U.S. last week, attempting to tamp things down with Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy, and that didn't work. He was only found himself being rebuked by Scott Bessent, the U.S. Treasury Secretary. So, getting back to the nuclear aspect of this, and John probably can get a little bit more detailed on the actual weapon system itself. I think this is just Trump messaging back. I think he intends to do it. I think he gets the double messaging here, not just to Putin, but to China as well. But I think this has more to do with anything. If I were to write the headline, it's just simply all about Putin being cornered, thinking that he could get out of that corner by threatening nukes, and Trump saying, you're not going to scare me. It was just a dumb move on the part of Putin, and Trump called him out on it. John?
No, it's I agree with everything Mark said. And look, this really goes back, I think, to some degree to the Biden administration, early stages of the war, when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, had a conversation with Gerasimov, the Russian general over the Russian forces, and he asked him, what are those conditions that would cause Russia to use nuclear weapons? And Gerasimov provided those conditions. But and it's the same time, I think the Biden administration at that time provided, showed their hand that they were worried about nuclear escalation, nuclear retaliation. Russia heard that loud and clear, and we have seen since that point, every time something goes against Russia, the introduction of HIMARS, the introduction of M1A1 tanks, the Patriot missile system being brought in to the country, the response from Putin has always been an escalatory response involving nuclear weapons, whether it was an actual exercise of his strategic nuclear forces or visibly showing, the nuclear football with his aid to any type, and to static displays of weapon systems during a pod. That's their fallback. The difference is it worked on the Biden administration, is not working with the Trump administration.
And you also probably read this report from the Washington Post that preparing the U.S. to resume nuclear tests could take years. And John, I'm really interested, how would you assess the readiness from your perspective and from your experience?
Sure. So the Strategic Command that actually handles our nuclear programs is an Air Force program, primarily a joint program as well. But every confidence that they maintain readiness, that the weapon systems are maintained and can be called upon when and if needed. We have processes, procedures in place that secure that weapon and ensure that everyone, upon issue of any order, acts in accordance to the plans. I don't think it will come to that, but I do believe this is, as Mark said, this is strategic messaging. This is telling Russia, I have the weapon, just like you. I can use the weapon in retaliation of what you do. It is not a first fire weapon system from the United States, but it is something that assures an 80s doctrine, which was mutual assured destruction. And I believe Putin understands mutual assured destruction. So while he flexes that I have nuclear weapons and I can do X, Y, and Z, he also knows that the United States and NATO have nuclear weapons here and retaliate in kind, and that balances the equation. So yes, we may say that we're going to do nuclear type of, I want to say exercises, but testing nuclear weapons. I think it's more along the lines of testing the delivery systems of those weapons. We haven't seen an above ground or below ground detonation in at least the United States in decades. I don't think we're going to see one now. Most of these things now can be done without the actual detonation of the weapon.
And yesterday, on Monday, we heard very good news for Ukraine. Britain has announced new additional Storm Shadow missiles to protect Ukrainian sky and Ukrainian infrastructure against Russian strikes. And just past weekend, we also saw blackouts, not in Moscow itself, but in the Moscow region. Mark, do you expect the number of these strikes on Russia to continue increasing?
Yeah, I think as Zelensky said and Trump's acknowledged, the best sanctions so far against Russia have really been in the form of deep strikes. And the Storm Shadow has been effective in doing that. And I think Ukraine gets it because, back in mid-October, I think around October 21st, they even came out, which I was a little bit surprised, and said that they struck the Bryansk chemical plant using a Storm Shadow, which was notable, basically saying, look, we've got these that traveled the 500 kilometers or so there to undertake that attack, and it destroyed it, and it's certainly capable of doing that. I think the bigger messaging of the Storm Shadows, though, and in conjunction with the sanctions that the U.S. Imposed upon Rosneft and Lukoil, the two largest oil companies in Russia, is that we're going to continue to go after military targets as well as your economic targets to try to bring Putin to his knees, to corner him yet one more way. And it's being effective. So Storm Shadows and their French equivalent have played a huge role. And it's good news that the UK continues to stock those up in terms of heading into winter, because as you just pointed out, Ukraine at its option can decide that, they're going to focus on taking out energy targets as well that can disrupt the economy, can disrupt the supply chain in Russia, getting things transported to Ukraine, to the battlefronts and everything, and that's good. John certainly can envision different uses of those Storm Shadows. So let me quickly flip to him and see what else he thinks that they can accomplish.
Yeah, Sophia, my comment's this. Ukraine's currently fighting 4 battles, actually 5 if you talk about the battle of propaganda and salesmanship. But the one battle that they're winning in, the one battle that they're successful in, that they're inflicting pain upon Russia, is that deep fight. It's striking those refineries. It's striking their production facilities. It's taking out the electrical grids of major cities that affect Russian citizens, not the ethnic minorities, but rather the Russian citizen. But that's at a cost, okay? They're focused on that, and they are simply, when I say simply, they are simply surviving the close fight, which is the fight in the trenches, the fight in the cities. They're holding the Russian advances, right? Banking, counting on the deep fight, winning the war. And they're also holding their own in what I would call the rear fight, which is the fight against the drones and the ballistic missiles that are impacting their cities. That is all about holding and surviving. The one piece that they have to turn their attention to, they have to pay more in resources to, is that war of interdiction. As long as Russia can continue to flow troops and supplies and materials and weapon systems into Ukraine, the longer this continues to go. Yes, Russia is losing 7,000 soldiers a week, but they're replenishing 7,000 soldiers a week. It has to be some effort, some additional effort allocated towards those forces. You said there are 170,000 forces in the Donetsk region, and that may be true, but they're coming from somewhere and they have to be struck. Why not strike them in their assembly areas and their marshalling areas? Why wait for them to come to the battlefield? And that's where you assume a lot of risk by forcing your soldiers to fight them individually as opposed to taking them out. So I do believe interdiction still is the key. Storm Shadow missile is a good weapon system for interdiction, as are HIMARS and ATACMS and the cluster munitions.
And the last topic which I want to discuss today with you is also sanctions, which you already touched on a bit. And we know it's already more than 1 week since President Trump announced his first sanctions against Russia during his second term as a president. And just according to recent Bloomberg reports, Chinese refineries are refusing Russian oil. And I just want to see and to know your opinion on the first results of the sanctions. What kind of results have you seen so far? And do you think these measures are effective? And has Trump achieved what he intended to achieve with these sanctions against Russia? Mark, go ahead.
I think, right. Sofia, he has. He has. As John, likes to say, and John's exactly right about this. It's not just the action that it counts. It's the reaction that you want to pay attention to. And in the reaction to these latest sanctions that the U.S. imposed, as I mentioned a little bit before on Rosneft and Lukoil, the two largest gas companies inside of Russia, was basically for Kirill Dmitriev, Putin's special envoy, the head of the Russian Sovereign Fund, to skedaddle, to use an American term, meaning run quickly, to Washington to try and meet with Steve Witkoff. Turned out it was in Pennsylvania to be accurate, but it didn't work. And so that reaction, that Russian reaction, if you will, tells us that Putin is very concerned about it. And the effect was immediate, because if you're seeing that, that means Putin got the message that the U.S. is getting serious about this. Now, what it's had, and I think somewhat surprisingly, is there's no secondary sanctions attached to it yet. So in other words, China, India, and that's where Russia today still sells 85% of its oil now. They had a little bit longer leash to keep buying that oil, but they decided both to pull back because they're fearing if that Russian unrefined oil gets into their pipeline and they start to refine it in their refineries, that it may be faced with secondary sanctions. So it also had a double effect, a good effect, in that it stopped, or at least curtailed would be the better word, not stopped, Russian and Chinese and Indian purchases of Russian oil. So that's a good thing. So these sanctions, surprisingly had more effect than we initially thought. And I think the fact that it just shows just how desperate Putin is in terms of Dmitriev traveling to the U.S. within days of those sanctions being imposed, because Putin realizes that without that economic lifeline that India and China have given him through the purchases of Russian oil, he's in trouble. So I would, give high marks for this. Trump, gets an A+ here because it's had an immediate effect.
John, and
I agree. I was just going to add that, look, I agree with everything Mark said. Putin thought he would be able to play through this because he assumed that the fellow BRICS nations would stand up and help him. And what he's seeing is that alliance, that economic alliance, is not, and that has scared him. So he's going to try to go faster and fight harder in order to offset that. But I don't think we've seen the full effect of the sanctions yet. It will take a couple of weeks, maybe a month before we see that. And by then we will be into the Russian winter months and it will have an impact.